going up. Elevator systems. Bowen Family Systems Theory in brief for a life of learning. Welcome to Elevator Systems, a podcast that explores Bowen Family Systems Theory concepts in brief and hopefully understandable ways. Today, our topic is societal emotional process, and joining Katie and I is another member of the Living Systems faculty, Lois Walker. Welcome, Lois. I will give a brief bio of Lois. Lois completed a diploma in nursing and then went on to obtain a BN. As a young graduate nurse, Lois became interested in observing the diversity among families and later the spiritual needs of individuals and families while working in cancer care and palliative care. In 1990, she entered the training program in Bowen theory at North Shore Counselling in Vancouver, while also completing a Masters of Divinity at UBC, and then completed 3 years of postgraduate training at the Georgetown Family Center, which is now the Bowen Center for the Study of the Family. Lois has spent the last 34 years learning and studying Bowen theory, and has taught and provided clinical supervision in the training program at Living Systems. So I'm really looking forward to thinking alongside you today, Lois. All right. So I think we have our work cut out for us today because I had 8 single-space typed pages of quotations that I pulled from my reading and then had to reduce into, these 30-second elevator pitches. But Lois, you get to go first with your elevator pitch on societal emotional process.
All right. I'm interested in the discussion we'll have on this. This concept came last in Bowen's theory and suggested a conceptual or theoretical bridge between emotional process in the family and emotional process in society. The concept of societal emotional process suggests that similar patterns of tension management that occur in the family are replicated or are parallel to the patterns that are occurring in society. The family's ability to adapt to challenges fluctuates with the level of maturity and level of anxiety. But what became evident to Dr. Bowen was that there was a parallel process occurring in society. All right, over to you.
Oh, okay, I think I'm next. Let's see. I think I might go a little different direction because I figured we might have similar. So I said at this concept at its core, like Lois said, extends the family emotional process to a larger field of study, but is still interested in the reciprocal process of how the individual and family influences the emotional functioning of society and vice versa. Excuse me. I was interested in and almost reactive. I would say I know this concept the least. But Bowen originally called this concept societal regression, but then changed the name to address how the functioning of society can progress and regress. So I got bogged down in examples, which I'll probably talk about more later. Well, I can talk a little bit more about regression, but I think one of the ways I'm going to try and bring today is to think about both the ways that society can progress as well as thinking about regressing and how we are interconnected.
All right, my turn. Societal emotional process describes how the patterns and processes that exist in families are also played out in society, between and within groups, cultures, and countries. Just like the family, society's functioning is influenced by how much anxiety, stress, and tension it is faced with. When that tension picks up, groups usually do more of what they've always done. And if they've been putting band-aids on broken bones, things can get worse until people step up and are willing to withstand the pain of setting the bone right. Which, I don't know how you have a broken bone in a country, but maybe there's lots of ways. And then I will do Dr. Bowen's pitch, and then we'll get into the discussion. So he was writing in family therapy and clinical practice. There's two papers, and I think they're from 1973 and 1974. And I thought one thing is that he says knowledge gained from the study of the family is of critical importance to the total human phenomenon. I thought that was pretty important right off the hop here. And he says the concept states that when a family is subjected to chronic, sustained anxiety, the family begins to lose contact with its intellectually determined principles and to resort more and more to emotionally determined decisions to allay the anxiety of the moment. The same process is evolving in society. We are in a period of increasing chronic social anxiety. Society responds to this with emotionally determined decisions to allay the anxiety of the moment. This results in symptoms of dysfunction, and the efforts to relieve the symptoms result in more emotional band-aid legislation, which increase the problem, and the cycle keeps repeating. And then he highlighted that you look at both regression and progression, like you highlighted, Katie. And then Dr. Kerr in Bowen Theory Secrets, which was written, I believe, in 2018, said Bowen's prediction for the current emotional regression in the US was that the regression would reverse when the pain of taking the easy way out exceeds the pain of taking a more principled long-term view direction. There we go.
I appreciate those. I highlighted another one of Bowen's comments when I was preparing for this because I get reactive to this regression idea sometimes, because I think it's how do you make an assessment based on fact? And one of the things that I took a deep dive when I was preparing for this episode was talking about regression and evolution. So how it was a challenge by a colleague to say, how do I understand regression from a natural system standpoint? Because I think one way I can get reactive to regression is how do we think neutrally about what's happening in society without our own lens of judgment or of how we think about what's right or wrong. So how do we get the most neutral? And regression in evolution is about a species reverting back to a more primitive form over time. And there is some debate about this in the field, which I didn't dive too hard into. But one of the things I found interesting is that things are always evolving and we can't know the advantage, I put that in quotes, to the evolutionary move in a short term. And I found a quote in Bowen that he kind of highlights that, where a nation can go into a regression just like a family does, and a nation can pull out in predictable ways. The only problem is the advantages to be realized from regressed behavior until the entire organism breaks down. So I think it's a plug for me in this concept of being cautious about a short-term view and really making sure we're taking a long-term view about understanding regression or societal emotional process.
That might be a more neutral way to use the language of regression. It's a descriptive word rather than a judgmental word, describing what's happening in a system versus judging that system. I mean, that's an interesting reflection on it. I'm always struck by Dr. Kerr many years ago introduced the work of Jacques Barzoon, From Dawn to Decadence. And Barzoon would say that throughout history, in every generation, we would say this is as bad as it can get. We would have a sense of doom or a sense of crisis or deterioration. And then how does one get more objective about that? I think Bowen theory has a way to think about the emotional functioning of the unit, which is also what happens in other species. As you described, the kind of this, is it fair to say, a slide in functioning? Anyway, I'll leave it there.
Yeah, the quote I found was reverting back to a more primitive form. That felt pretty neutral to me.
Well, anything else stand out in the different pitches? What was highlighted? Was there anything missing? Anything to add?
I was going to say something about the leadership in the family, or the principles that guide a family, and or perhaps the unclarity. Now, I don't know whether I'm leaping ahead in terms of other areas that you want to talk about today, but it seems to me that what Dr. Bowen was trying to describe was the unsureness in the parent, or the that when the family was met with challenge, or when society is met with challenge, there's an unsureness about how to address it. And so there's this kind of permissiveness or overleniency, as he describes it, or there's this kind of punitive, autocratic, top-down, sometimes termed mean or aggressive kind of response to it as well. But it's coming out of the unsureness versus the maturity of the family, which I think is an important idea. Now, I don't know how you would put that into a natural systems lens, Katie, but I think that's a very interesting kind of perspective, is to think about the family's meeting is confronted with a symptom or a challenge, and it is unsure how to deal with it, and becomes more emotional in responding to it rather than thoughtful about how do we address this in a mature way or a responsible way.
Yeah, I think, one of the things when I was preparing for this, I was reading Dr. Kerr's review of the blue-footed boobies, I think it was, no, it wasn't. It was a different bird.
Speak of the finch. The finches, the Galapagos, yeah.
Yes, where there was that reactivity in the sense of hyper reproduction. So, maybe that's seeming responsible if there is a worry, or there is a sense in the emotional system of rising tension or things shifting. There is sort of this action, this intensive action that takes place. I just get, how do you tell if the system is thoughtful when you get out of the human?
The sequel to that story, though, about the finches is that it was so intensely driven in reproduction that it wasn't sustainable. Mm-hmm. And that when the food sources supplied, they weren't able to nurture their young. They didn't build appropriate nests. I mean, there was a decline in the entire unit. So there's that. So I don't know if I think there are corollaries in society at a societal level, but how does one get more objective about the process, or see the process and then function better in it? I think that's where we're going with this conversation today, is what to do with.
Well, in what I've enjoyed doing these concepts this season is that I have intentionally tried to watch movies that I think will sort of highlight what each of these concepts is about. And so for this one, I watched the new Bob Dylan, A Complete Unknown, his new movie, the biopic. And I watched Forrest Gump because I'm like, well, that's kind of Bowen's era that they're dealing with. And then suddenly that old fable of the sky is falling came to my head. And of course, there's Don't Look Up, which is a newer movie. But I decided, what if I just take it back, take it easy a little bit? And so I watched Chicken Little, the Disney movie from like the early 2000s, which is all about, that old sky is falling fable. And what's really interesting in that Disney version of it, they talk about Chicken Little has some unresolved issues with his father that he is encouraged to address, and it helps him kind of gain some courage. So it's a cute little version of it. But I was thinking about that old fable of the sky is falling, and then all of the friends' reactions, and then the fox kind of uses that to his advantage. And so two things stuck out to me. One is, how do we assess the problem? What is the problem in this fable? Is the sky falling or isn't? And then what do you notice about how the group is responding to the stress and the fear? So that was my lighter version. Not that those fables are they're not always very nice, but at least it's animated. Yeah.
Lois,
Other,
do you have an
yeah.
example, or I can?
Well, I do have an example, but I guess I'm really interested in what both of you are stirring for me is how does one assess this accurately and what are the criteria one would use to assess whether a family is in a slide and that how is that replicated or reproduced in society. I used the example of the movie Conclave, and I was so interested in Conclave. I thought, firstly, the acting was terrific, and I also thought the cinematography was brilliant. But I was very struck by the challenge that this group of cardinals from all over the world are up against when the Pope dies. And what you watched was coalitions forming, meaning in Bowen theory, triangles were forming, heightened anxiety, loss of principle or compromising of principles, loss of thinking, deterioration of the kind of principles that would guide. I had a whole bunch of ideas here. What I had written. Conspiracies, threat assessment became inaccurate and it became distorted. So our ability to kind of see and appraise what's going on begins to be distorted. Functioning declined, principles were diluted, and it became harder to access thinking. I thought that was just a great example of what Dr. Bowen would have described as some of the things that begin to happen in a family under pressure and what begins to happen at a societal. It's a reciprocal kind of equilibrium. I was thinking about the parallel process in British Columbia that we've just had with this kind of confusion about how to handle the drug crisis. Just and going from over leniency to this kind of punitive, but really at a loss as to how to address this effectively, respectfully, and not just seeing the problem within this population. At any rate, I could go on and on because I find it also very, very fascinating.
I'm excited because I haven't seen either the Bob Dylan one or this Conclave movie, so now I have movies to go watch. I really challenged myself to think of progression. So I was trying to find a movie where the influence moves a system upward. And here's what I'm going to throw out there. People can choose to disagree with me. But I thought of the Shawshank Redemption. Closed society. I looked up definitions of society. So it's a closed system, pretty tense, that an individual comes into a society, the prison, and just has a different way of thinking about hope and takes some principled actions, does some challenging things to stay in line with his principles, to challenge authority. And you see shifts in the system and in people's functioning and the way they begin to act differently. So I wanted to be challenged to say, where would this look where it would move a system up? And I don't think everyone in the system moves up. I mean, there are definitely people in that prison that continue to have symptoms, but I just was interested in the way that it potentially is an example of a movie where an individual who has a clear thinking about their principles, who takes on a little bit of a leadership role. And I think he takes on a leadership role in that group, and that how you see group members begin to function a little more flexible. Like even the guards begin to be a little more flexible with their rigidity. So challenge me, but I thought that was my effort at thinking about a progression in a system.
Well, I'll tell you the little thing that comes to mind here is maybe 10 years ago, my husband was a youth pastor and we had all the youth over for New Year's Eve, and we had some movie options, and we didn't show them Shawshank Redemption because we saw how many swear words were in it. And instead we watched one of the Ocean's movies, and they were like, so we're cheering for the criminals here? Like, we could be watching a movie filled with swears that has like this actual redemptive, useful message, or our criteria is swears, and so we're going to cheer for the criminals. So That was our
That
little
would be
reflection.
that would be an emotional decision. One of the
Yeah.
things that is really important to me in this concept that I think Dr. Bowen is getting at is that this theory is rooted in the natural sciences and evolution, as you say, Katie, and that the emotional system in Bowen theory is understood to be our biology. And I think what you're describing in the finches gets at the instinctual, what I always am appreciative of in Bowen theory is how much of our decision making, how much of our intellectual capacity is under the control of or operation of the emotional system. And I think that's in essence an essential part of this concept, is that appreciating how much we are emotionally driven.
Yes.
Go
And
ahead.
I'm going to say, so I sat and I challenged myself and I'm like, I just cannot think of an example for this concept. I was just struggling. And for my book club, I'm reading The Revenge of the Tipping Point. And as I read at night, and as I'm sitting down trying to chew on this, I thought, oh my goodness, I actually think, so my takeaway is going to be like this. I think that book begins to give data examples of how society is influenced by these outside characters. I mean, I'm only a third of the way in. Malcolm Gladwell is not talking about family very much in this as of yet. He has some family examples, but he's looking at groups of people. The chapters I've looked at talked about how he's talking about how individuals kind of change rapidly based on context and circumstance. How numbers of gender makeup really influence people's behaviors. But I think in a sense, if someone were to really take a deep dive with that book, it would be looking at this data and saying there is a way that people are making decisions that don't seem to logically make sense based on these contextual factors, like who they're surrounded by, where they're living in a country, and I think that's a little bit of, I think what Bowen is getting at is how there's this current underneath that is impacting our behavior, our functioning in ways that we might not be as aware of.
I think we have the blessing of being in British Columbia, where I go a slightly different direction than you in terms of the how the human is tuned to nature. And Dr. Bowen's theory, this concept is coming out of his belief, I guess, that the human is tuned to nature because of our instinctual relationship with the environment, and that we know that there's a disturbance in nature. I mean, Dr. Kerr, I think, says that as the human comes through this, we're going to live in better harmony with nature. But we see how nature, the environment, I think that's what triggered this whole research of Dr. Bowen's, was looking at what he would call the collision course with the environment. And I think, the meeting that we had a few years back on societal process and climate, we talked about the variables of population growth. We talked about the migration from political instability. We talked about food scarcity or food security. We talked about, all of I think the human is tuned in to these challenges at the emotional level. Now, that may be I do have some thoughts about progression as well, but I do think that he's punching up that we are deeply biological. We are closer to our evolutionary past than we admit or acknowledge or appreciate.
And our species is adapt to a challenge. We're at a less intellectual level. Our system is responding to a challenge
At a very emotional level. Yeah.
Does that show up in the hoarding the toilet paper in COVID? Like, is that an example of this is the necessity, and I'm gonna make sure that my me and my
Well,
group
it certainly
has.
was a punching up of the chronic anxiety, the punching up of the anxiety. And so what begins to happen? What do we begin to observe in ourselves or um, among family members or at a societal level when the anxiety goes up? What happens to our functioning? What do we do? And maybe hoarding
And
is a
and
piece.
I thought we would talk about COVID today, and I think the useful thing about COVID from a theory level is it was experienced by everyone. I was thinking about these events that help us to understand human functioning is when everyone is exposed to them. How is the variation in the way that people respond to that useful in understanding people? I thought a war or a conflict, you could take like a group in a country or a society, but COVID was one where the whole world on some level was exposed to that
And dealt with it
event.
very differently.
Yeah.
And countries dealt with it sort of the reality. I mean, certainly they got into the overstringency, et cetera, but there was such variation among areas in terms of how they dealt with it.
And I thought that was such a good parallel for the other place. I mean, I know Bowen thought about this around climate, but his early study was around the parallels between the juvenile delinquent system, juvenile justice system, and how families were managing a child protection process. So I think another thing where you can watch these parallels to see variation. I just appreciate that. That's one of the things I always like to think through is how there's variation in how people are responding to these challenges.
I had a conversation with my 96-year-old great aunt this week, and we were talking, the fires in California and lots of stressors in the world these days. And she commented, she's like, back in World War II, she was an adult in World War II. We would hear about some of these things, but you really didn't. You would hear a little bit, and then she's like, and then we'd get on with our life, and then maybe a little bit more news would trickle in, and thinking about how amazing it is and how useful it can be that we have this instantaneous knowledge across the world and can e-transfer or mobilize resources. And the downside of that is that we are also aware on a minute-to-minute basis the crises across the world.
Yeah, and the other part of that too, and I mean, I've been watching the videos of the fires, and so we're recording this in, what is it, mid-January.
13th. Yeah.
That how my nervous system responds to watching that distress, which would be so different than if I read it in a newspaper, maybe, or if I read about it. I don't know. I'm just interested in when my face is seeing this in real time and people's faces responding to it in their distress. I think I'm interested how that really shows up to heighten up my nervous system.
I'm not sure if this isn't a digression, but many years ago we had a meeting at Living Systems with Kathy Wiseman on leadership in the work system. And we titled the meeting, "The Only Person I Can Manage Is Myself," which I think was a kind of relevant and clever title. But I think it's an important idea to this conversation. Now, I mean, I think that would be an essential piece of what Dr. Bowen was getting at in this concept was, what is it that pulls a family out of a slide, of a serious symptom? Or what is it that pulls a society out of a slide or a serious kind of challenge? And I think it's principled. It's somehow principled leadership. It's somehow the capacity to stay in good contact with people, but to also not participate in the problem in the same way. And I have been interested in reading Eleanor Ostrom's research that she did. She won a Nobel for it on managing the common the resources that are common among us and how to manage those responsibly. And that takes principled leadership. It's going to be very, very interesting how we do that globally, locally, as countries now, as we face some big environmental challenges. So that's just a wandering in the reeds there. But I do think that he was Dr. Bowen suggested that our brains had the capacity to do both great good and great harm. And I think we are at the cusp of that in my reading. You may not see it this way, but I think we're at the cusp of that in my reading about AI and the potential that can move it forward. And I think it's Mukherjee who talks about it as AI Fukushima. He talks about it as being potentially, advancing science and medicine tremendously and having huge potential. And then also what is the risk and the danger? So how will that play out? We need to see. Pardon?
I said, and what is gray? I mean, I imagine that there's also that in between of where there will be benefits and
costs.
Yes, thank you.
I think always.
Yeah.
I think always. But then what is the maturity of the individual or the people that are participating that contribute to it going either way, one way or the other?
Yeah.
Does it come back to the only person I can manage is myself? I don't know. That's too simplistic, but I think it's
useful.
It's a variable to think about.
One of my takeaways, I was going to go in a different direction. Lois kind of talked about how does a person use this. I was thinking about my functioning as a clinician and how this concept is useful to me to really understand and think with a family about, the functioning and what people are up against. I stole a quote from Anne McKnight's in the Thinking Systems book, which was, what is useful for the clinician to recognize that family life is situated in the stressors and level of societal anxiety, a context for understanding how the family is functioning. So I think it really helped me think about, as a clinician, how do I better understand the functioning of this family? How do I use my knowledge? How do I, encourage the family or do a little research on myself, like the history of what this family has been up against over time? So that's how I think one of the ways it's really quite useful to me.
And likely useful to them.
Yeah. Yeah. I joked I didn't know I was going to become a historian when I decided to be a family therapist.
I'm just glad to occasionally find some use out of my history degree. There's two things that I'll put up in the show notes, but the Bowen Center's Family Matters video series, they had two. One was on political reactivity and self-regulation, and the other was making decisions in the midst of an emotionally aroused social environment. And I thought both of those discussions were worth thinking about.
Yeah.
Lois, did you have any, takeaways or questions for further thinking?
Let me go to Katie and see if I can pull my thought.
All right, I'll say my two. One is a takeaway for myself. So just go down, Lois is the only person I can manage myself. And doing this podcast, this episode has really highlighted for me some gaps in my learning. So one takeaway is for me to go get a little clearer on this concept and some of my reactivity around it. But I think one of the challenges, I know some of the people who are listening to this podcast are people who are, have done a lot of study in Bowen theory. So my challenge to this group was really one that was given to me, which is how do you begin to get more neutral about this concept and really how do you go back to natural systems thinking to observe society. Like how do you get at the facts of functioning of society? So that's the challenge I would give to people, probably new and old, to the theory. All right, Lois.
I think one of the takeaways that is always sobering for me is Dr. Bowen's underscoring of the fact that we are more emotionally driven than we like to admit. And I think, how do I have a better read on that, both as a, just in my life, in my daily life, in my relationship life, and in my clinical work? How do I know when I'm tacking one direction versus being a little bit more thoughtful about what the earth is up against?
Mm-hmm. One of the questions that went through my brain was, what is my criteria for how I define the problem and how I define progress? And who or what or when or how long would, all of those variables would go into it. Am I just thinking about myself right now? Am I thinking about others? Yeah.
That's a tricky one, this
I really
one.
appreciated Katie's comment about, I think reading in the natural sciences, I think is very, very helpful. So I think it gets us into thinking more systemically and perhaps less judgmentally. At least it's a correction for me to just be an observer of a process of, and I think somehow I'm reading Deborah Gordon's new book, The Ecology of Cooperative Behavior. It's just descriptive. It's very, very useful.
What I took, and this will be my last comment, what I took from evolution is always just this real respect for the long view. I mean, I think that is what is so useful to me to think about evolution is, that we won't really know. I mean, I think we don't know exactly what the behavior of the now is going to produce in the human of the future. So to be interested in that.
Well, thanks for being here today, Lois. I think it's a pretty timely discussion in January 2025. And so I hope that those of you who have tuned in today will keep on thinking as you go out into your relationships. This podcast is produced by Living Systems, a nonprofit organization in Vancouver offering counseling and training programs in Bowen family systems theory across Canada.